What makes patients who attempted suicide grateful that their attempts failed? How do you find meaning in an empty life? How can you overcome circumstances and emerge victorious, no matter how bad they are? What drove Viktor Frankl to survive 3 horrific years in Nazi concentration camps and still come out as a survivor? Why is letting go the only way to live your life? What happens when you trust and surrender to fate? Let's start with a staggering fact. Dr. Viktor Frankl treated over 12,000 patients who had attempted suicide. And guess what? Later, all these patients were grateful their suicide attempts had failed. You heard that right. Grateful. Why? Because with time and a bit of patience, they found solutions to their seemingly insurmountable problems. So, if you're thinking about calling it quits and ending your life, think again. Life is like a book. You don't judge it by reading just the first and last pages. You've got to live through the chapters, no matter how tough, to see how the story unfolds. Even if you're stuck in what feels like an endless loop of despair, remember this. Even the helpless victim of a hopeless situation, facing a fate he cannot change, may rise above himself, may grow beyond himself, and by so doing change himself. He may turn a personal tragedy into a triumph. That's straight from the man himself, Dr. Viktor Frankl, in his legendary book, Man's Search for Meaning. But who is this Viktor Frankl? Anyway, now don't dismiss Frankl as just another know-it-all spouting wisdom from his cozy armchair. No, Frankl's life was a real-life horror story. Whatever you're going through, it probably isn't a patch on what he endured. Frankl was a Holocaust survivor, spending more than 3 years in Nazi concentration camps. Picture this, being treated worse than an animal, constantly beaten and degraded, barely surviving on a crust of bread and a bowl of watery soup, trudging through snow in worn-out shoes and tattered clothes, and sleeping on bunk beds so cramped that 9 people had to share the space meant for 2. If you think your life is bad, at least you're not in a concentration camp with no clue if your family or friends are alive and no certainty you'll ever be free to see them again. Now, if a man who lived through that isn't qualified to talk about the meaning of life and surviving the worst odds, then I don't know who is. How did survivors survive in such inhumane conditions? The million-dollar question: what kept some people alive in the concentration camps when 6 million Jews perished in one of humanity's darkest chapters? What does it take to survive when all odds are against you? Here are a few key takeaways from Frankl's experience. 1. Adaptability. Frankl observed that the prisoners' ability to adapt was extraordinary. They could survive without sleep for long periods and fall asleep in the most uncomfortable conditions. They had no proper dental hygiene, yet their teeth remained healthy. They wore the same ragged clothing for days, and despite this, their sores from manual labor didn't fester. As Dostoevsky once said, "Man is a creature that can get accustomed to anything, and I think that is the best definition of him." Even if you lose your hands, lose your feet, man can still adapt and live. 2. Letting go. Freedom doesn't guarantee happiness, especially when your entire world has been shattered. Many Jews found no one waiting for them when they were finally liberated. They had no home to return to, no family to reunite with. Those who couldn't let go of their painful past often fell into despair. Those who could, however, found a way to move forward. Frankl himself found solace when, upon his release, he dropped to his knees in front of a meadow and felt overwhelming gratitude for his newfound freedom. That moment was the beginning of his new life, a life that would not be dictated by his torturous past, but would instead draw strength from it. 3. Surrender to fate. Frankl escaped death by surrendering to faith. Not once, not twice, but 3 times. Firstly, Frankl had an immigration visa to the US. He could have escaped the horror altogether, but his sense of duty to his aging parents weighed heavily on his conscience. In his uncertainty, he sought a sign from God, and he got one. A piece of marble inscribed with the commandment, "Honor thy father and thy mother, that thy days be long upon the land." That settled it. He decided to stay. And even after undergoing the worst kind of suffering in concentration camps for 3 years, he still emerged as a survivor. Secondly, when he was selected for transfer to a so-called rest camp, no one knew if they were heading to safety or a gas chamber. Frankl took the chance, and it turned out to be a lucky break, because famine broke out in his previous camp, which even led certain desperate people to become cannibals. Thirdly, he narrowly avoided death again when he was left behind, due to a lack of space in the trucks transporting prisoners. Those left behind were freed later by the Allied forces, whereas those transported were burned alive in a nearby camp. Life spared him once more. And why? Because he chose to trust fate. Some might call his decision not to flee to America foolish, but if he had escaped, he wouldn't have become the profound voice that speaks to us through his works even today, when he is long dead and buried. His experiences lent credibility to his theories put forward in his scientific doctrine of logotherapy, making him one of the most respected figures in existential psychology in the entire world. Rising above circumstances. Is man merely a product of his circumstances, or can he transcend them? Frankl witnessed both horrors and acts of kindness in the concentration camps. Even in the darkest places, some people were willing to share their last piece of bread or offer a helping hand. Humanity shone through the unlikeliest of individuals. This teaches us that no matter how bleak the situation, you always have a choice. You can choose how to react. Even in a concentration camp, even in real life, you always have that power to choose. Those who gave up on the present quickly gave up on life too. If they fixated on how long their suffering would last, they faced endless disappointment. In life, there isn't a guaranteed expiration date for suffering. Frankl likened suffering to gas. It fills up the space it's given, just like suffering can consume your mind if you let it. If you keep longing for the past or lose hope for the future, you're missing the opportunities hidden in the present. Finding meaning amid suffering. The death rate in Frankl's camp spiked between Christmas 1944 and New Year 1945. Why? Because the prisoners hoped to be home by Christmas. When that didn't happen, their disappointment turned fatal. This shows how a lack of hope in the future can kill faster than any physical ailment. Many people today find themselves in an existential vacuum, feeling like life is meaningless. Frankl's philosophy is clear. Life's meaning isn't some grand, universal truth. It differs from person to person, hour to hour. So, how do you find meaning in life? Every person is different, and so is his vocation. What he should do to make life meaningful will differ for him, as much as his circumstances will differ from the other person. So, as Frankl puts it, it is not the man who should be asking this question from anyone. Rather, it is the other way around. He should realize that he is the one who is being asked this question by life itself, and he should answer it for his own unique life. So it is not life that is responsible towards him, but rather he that is responsible towards his own life. And Frankl points out that the true meaning of life is to be discovered outside in the world, not within yourself. If you have been put in a certain set of circumstances, then it is your responsibility to understand what is the meaning you can take out from it. No matter how dire your circumstances, there's always a way to find meaning in them. You have the power to turn a personal tragedy into a personal triumph. Frankl once helped an old man who was devastated by the loss of his beloved wife. When the man realized his wife would have suffered deeply if she had lost him instead, he found a new perspective. His suffering now had a purpose. It was his way of sparing her from grief. Similarly, during his own imprisonment, Frankl clung to the memory of his wife's face and the vision of himself lecturing to an audience in the future. Those mental images kept him going when he had nothing else. Logotherapy, Frankl's school of thought, teaches that man's ultimate aim isn't just to seek pleasure or avoid pain, but to find meaning in life, even in suffering. Yes, even when he is suffering, he will gladly suffer if he can find a meaning in his suffering. Edith Westhoff-Jolson, professor of psychology at the University of Georgia, has shown how the present-day culture lays too much emphasis on the pursuit of happiness. It is believed that any form of unhappiness is a maladjustment which needs to be immediately corrected. So the unnecessary strain of being happy all the time puts a further strain on an unhappy person, who is made to feel not only guilty but also ashamed at feeling unhappy. But at the same time, logotherapy also makes it clear that it is not necessary to suffer in order to find meaning in your life. If that suffering can be avoided, then it must be avoided. There is no heroism in suffering needlessly. As Frankl wisely notes, after all, man is that being who invented the gas chambers of Auschwitz. However, he is also that being who entered those gas chambers upright, with the Lord's Prayer on his lips. Viktor Frankl's life story isn't just an inspiring tale of survival. It's a roadmap for finding meaning in even the most challenging circumstances. Remember, it's not about avoiding pain. It's about finding purpose in it.
We touched on a few chapters, but there's much more to know. Read the complete book to let the wisdom flow. Turn pages, chase dreams, erase every doubt. Until next time, a bookster's signing out.